It's a real pleasure to be here. Bob's been inviting me and the centre for many years, and somehow we just haven't made it happen. And it's just wonderful to be here finally, and to be back with so many good old friends. I'm older than others, right? But yeah, it's great to be back and to be renewing contact with people. Some people might think us CSR folk get together all the time, but it's actually been quite a long time since we did. So it's been really lovely to do that, and it's so nice to be here to make some attempt to honor Bob and his legacy. I hesitate to use the word legacy because you're not done yet, right? Um, but that's a huge honor that hopefully I can live up to in some way with this talk. I might be wrong about this, but I think that my first encounter with Bob was through his paper co-authored with Tom called Crisis of Conscience, Riddle of Identity. I was actually probably barely into my teens, I think, when they wrote it and when it was published. And the paper was probably about 10 years old when I first read it. But I have to say, it was still really hot stuff, really powerful stuff, at least to me. And I know to many others, actually. And I was quite early on in my PhD studies in anthropology. Yeah, but I was in an anthropology department. I was starting out in a PhD in the cognitive science of religion. It was still not a new field, but we still called it an emerging field, I think, at the time. We were talked a lot about the theory running ahead of the data. And so I was in an anthropology department. I was keen to have quite a significant ethnographic component to the work that I was doing, and to test some of the emerging theories and hypotheses in the cognitive anthropology at the time. I had been wading through, I think that's the best way to describe it, wading through what I considered to be impenetrable ethnographies in the anthropology of religion at the time. People who wrote them, the anthropologists who wrote them, said that they were writing in deliberately obscure language. It was self-consciously and utterly vague language, such that the final interpretation of these thick, over-interpreted descriptions could lie with the reader. I had no training in this at all, no literary training. I didn't think or ever write or have practice in this kind of thing. And I felt utterly lost trying to wade through these ethnographies. I thought I was in trouble. So I was captivated from Tom and Bob's very first line. Two disciplines are in trouble. They were, of course, the anthropology and the history of religion that they wrote about in this paper. And what was the trouble? Well, I think we all know by now, given the talks that we've already listened to, hermeneutic exclusivism. And to be fair, I probably didn't understand what that meant at the time. But Tom's and Bob's writing rang clear as a bell to me after wading through some of this other kind of writing. The obscurantist, I think, is the term that Harvey used, this kind of writing. Anthropology had abandoned science and now had an exclusive mandate for the interpretation rather than the explanation of cultures and their texts. It was full of punchy sentences about anthropologists having thrown out the scientific baby with the colonialist bathwater. Epistemology will never go away. And a whole section on the harm, in big caps, I didn't add that, harmful effects of the hermeneutic method. So what to do? Well, redress the imbalance. We've heard a lot about hermeneutic exclusivism already. Don't abandon science. Ask big questions, seek big answers, test them against the evidence. So this imbalance, of course, between hermeneutic exclusivism and the relative absolute dearth of explanatory theory in anthropology. And in particular, look to the cognitive sciences for inspiration. So start by looking to the cognitive sciences in developing explanatory accounts of human behaviour and culture. Now, this goal was shared by others across anthropology and religious studies, and to Bob's and Tom's immeasurable influence on my thinking and also at that time my confidence and my sense of value in what we were trying to do, I would, of course, add Harvey, Pascal, and Justin in particular as well. The hope is that, or was and still is, I think, that in turn anthropology would contribute to the cognitive sciences and take up its seat again at the table of scientific explanation. After all, anthropology is a founding member of the cognitive sciences. And you can see here the kind of original Sloan hexagon of cognitive science, in which we have all of these different disciplines, very much including anthropology. This was, I think, put out, 1978. And around the same time, the journal for the Society of Cognitive Science, or the kind of flagship journal for cognitive science, was established. And anthropology is in there. There's one addition in the most recent kind of hexagon that we have here, which is education. But anthropology is still there. And it's integrated, or should be at least, within its neighbouring disciplines in this new interdisciplinary or emerging interdisciplinary cognitive sciences of the time. However, by some recent analyses, anthropology, and we've heard a lot again about this today, but anthropology is still largely missing in action. So there's a recent study that came out in Nature Human Behaviour. It's an analysis of over 1,000 cognitive science articles, so the journal Cognitive Science, from 2001 to 2018. And there are different ways in which one might measure interdisciplinarity, and that's the main concern of this particular paper, is kind of how, I think the title is What Happened to Cognitive Science? And they measure interdisciplinarity in various ways. Some have critiqued the ways in which they measure it. But here I want to focus in particular on anthropology. And the author affiliation of authors on papers, articles in cognitive science over that time, shows a huge dearth of anthropologists. Like they say, and philosophers. Anthropologists and philosophers are functionally absent from the journal, accounting for just 1% and 3% of the total affiliations, respectively. So there's a huge skew towards psychology, you can say. You can see psychology is relatively overrepresented among authors in cognitive science. So we've got more like not so much a hexagon, it's been all pulled out of shape. I've called it a shuttle here. That was my best overlay. They've done another analysis looking at cognitive science programs in universities in North America, which showed that there wasn't a single institution that required cognitive science majors to take a course in anthropology. You may have an option course in some form of anthropology, but it's not a requirement, at least at this time of publication, to have anthropology in the cognitive science course. They made the other particular point that a lot of cognitive science is still just integrating different disciplines in a more multidisciplinary way than an interdisciplinary way. So there's only a quarter of programs that actually have an interdisciplinary cognitive science component to their required courses in cognitive science. But the point to make here is that not a single institution required cognitive science majors to take a course in anthropology. Okay. Steve Levinson, of course, said that the anthropologists, no secret, anthropologists went on a postmodernist holiday in the 1980s and they've never come back. And that's perhaps part of the problem here. And we talked a little bit about that, I think, already today, but it's maybe also fair to say that it's only part of the problem. As he says, classical cognitive science treats humans like an asocial species without culture. And in so doing, it misses the heart of the phenomenon. In contrast, anthropology takes as its focus human beings, not understood as essentially sort of brain-based individuals, but as historically, socially, and culturally situated meaning makers. Anthropologists' interests are therefore much more in the diverse particulars of what it is to be human, and not so much in the general universals, in contrast to traditional, sort of orthodox cognitive science. But meanwhile, since even Bob and Tom exhorted us to look to the cognitive sciences for inspiration, a sensitivity to the context of cognition has gained huge ground in cognitive science, with the growing understanding and much debate still around cognition as embodied, extended into the environment, enacted, so we cognize and think and feel through our activity, and embedded in our social and cultural settings, or 4E cognition, so embodied, extended, enacted, and embedded. I think that maybe rethinking cognition and the emergence of these new kind of more context-specific approaches to cognition can perhaps open the door to anthropologists returning from their holiday, to engage with and to shape the science of cognition and culture, and to bring rich description and interpretation to explanatory theory and vice versa. And as Bob advances this interactionist position in the recent JCC paper, what stuff means to people can directly inform our explanatory theorizing about culture, while explanatory theory can help clarify what kinds of meanings are most likely to arise and persist in individual minds and in culture. So Claire mentioned a little bit of my early work that I went on to do in my PhD. It was based in Brazil, looking at the cognition of spirit possession. I was based in Brazil, but spirit possession, of course, is an extremely widespread concept or belief cross-culturally. And in this work, I followed this sort of ladder approach that we've been talking about, using explanatory theory from cognitive psychology to generate hypotheses about the bases of religious meaning, particularly what spirit possession was all about. So why possession by spirits perceived as persons differs from possession by spirits perceived as pathogens. Why a cognitive perspective encourages us to define these as quite distinct cultural phenomena, drawing from distinct sort of cognitive underpinnings, even though we might label them by the same term, right? And how universal mind-body dualism can inform and constrain possession concepts and how they arise cross-culturally and what form they take. So that's what I went on to do. But actually in this talk, I'm going to do a little bit of, not much of a seg, but I'm going to shift onto what we've been doing in our more recent work, throughout which I hope to show that alongside hypotheses drawn from the interdisciplinary cognitive sciences, fertile interpretations of the kind anthropologists and others can document so richly can enrich our accounts of the multi-level causal processes that sustain social bonding and cooperation in real-world joint activities. So that's kind of where the focus of our research is primarily now. And I just want to acknowledge the huge input of colleagues in the research group that I lead at Oxford called the Social Body Lab within the Institute of Human Sciences. So all of the work that I'll touch on today is collaborative within the context of this group. And we take a broad, I don't know what to call it, let's say, for the sake of this talk, a broad cognitive science perspective, evolutionary anthropology, lots of different disciplines or skills or knowledge bases coming in to help us try and address some of these questions about the links among social connection, group activity, and health in everyday behavior and culture. So let's start with a very particular fertile interpretation of joint activity. And this book is actually a fascinating story about the, spoiler alert, the winning eights in the 1936 Hitler's Berlin Olympics in 1936. These guys came from the West Coast. They were all very working class guys, came from the West Coast. They absolutely stuffed the prestigious elite East Coast guys to make it to the Olympics, to represent their country. And they went on to win the Germans in a absolutely fabulous finale in this book. Really interesting story. But it's also got some wonderfully rich descriptions of connections between joint action and social bonding. The oars enter and leave the water at precisely the same instant. 16 arms must begin to slide forward and backward. 8 backs must bend and straighten all at once. Each minute action must be mirrored exactly by each oarsman, from one end of the boat to the other. Only then will it feel as if the boat is a part of them. Of course, this kind of synchrony is absolutely critical to boat velocity. So it's something that they have to practice and practice and practice. But it has really special psychological effects. Almost mystical bonds of trust and affection lift a crew above the ordinary sphere, transport it to a place where 9 boys somehow became one thing. It was a rare thing, a sacred thing. And from this description and many others throughout this book, we can distill a strong sense that the coordinated alignment of individuals as they act and as they strive together in perfect synchrony is linked to powerful subjective emotional experiences and perceptions of oneness and something like awe, even sacredness, that are, I think, inherently social. Another example, for those who've participated on a team that is known the click of communality, the experience is unforgettable, like that of having attained, for a while at least, a higher level of existence as it ought to be. Now, there's a lot of interpretive license in pieces of literature such as this, but we can observe how across contexts and cultures, humans everywhere get together to move together in similar sorts of ways. And the behaviours aren't peculiar to sacred moments, whether in religion or sport. And while many details of interpretation might differ from context to context, there appear to be fairly common emotional and social effects or meanings. Now, I probably don't need to repeat what Durkheim said all those years ago, but one of the most influential and one of the earliest accounts that focused on the social bonding function of these activities comes from Durkheim and his concept of collective effervescence. And he describes something very similar. I won't read it all through, but essentially distilling it down, you get something I think he called muscular bonding, leading to collective feeling and ultimately what he called moral unity. So these are his terms. Perhaps in the terms of current cognitive sciences, we might say something like group movement or joint action, or sometimes it might be exercise, might be physical activity, it might be any of these rituals or a non-ritual kind of thing, but something like that, leading to social bonding and cooperation ultimately. So moving from a general, I don't know whether that's a general interpretive theory, I think it's a functionalist theory, but moving from that sort of interpretation of these kinds of events to explanatory theory, the key question is, how is this function realized through such activities? So how do these joint movements, like collective, coordinated, independent movement, influence social bonding? And here I take social bonding to mean positive emotional states and behaviors that create, maintain, and characterize affiliation and attachment among individuals. And I won't talk too much about this, but it's an extremely important aspect of what it is to be human. Of course, social bonding is absolutely fundamental to human survival, optimal health, as much research is showing now, and unique forms of cooperation and social learning. But what are the causal processes that contribute to social bonding in these kinds of activities? Well, here we can look to the cognitive sciences. And traditionally, this meant going inside the head. However, inspired by the descriptive and interpretive detail of real-world examples and by advances in a more situated, embodied cognitive science, we can look beyond the head for possible causes in the interactive space between brain and body and between individuals. So shortly, I'll present some of our empirical work on this how question. A second issue that we focused on more recently turns the question around a little bit and looks at the effects of social bonding on subjective emotions and experiences in joint action. We've looked particularly at effects of social bonding and perceived social support on perceived fatigue and ultimately the physiology, psychophysiology of how we regulate energy, so energy regulation. So here again, we've drawn in part on fertile descriptions and interpretations from the sort of sports literature. This bit I didn't add on earlier, but I'll add on now. Only when you've got this perfect synchrony and the emotional effects that arise from it, does pain entirely give way to exaltation and effort is replaced by ecstasy. Is it just poetic license, or is there more to it? Can this visceral bonding in joint exertive goal-oriented activity alter the psychophysiology of effort, pain, and fatigue? it's not just that example. It's not just an isolated example. All team sports have similarities. In basketball, when things are going right, you're said to be in the flow. In rowing, that's magnified. It's astonishing because it feels like you have at your command the power of everybody else in the boat. You are exponentially magnified. And what was a strain before comes easier. And we can take as our point of departure a very general observation from Cacioppo and Patrick in their book on loneliness, that the social and the physiological cannot be separated any more than we can separate the length from the width of a triangle. And I think this quote captures the fact that in humans, for whom evolutionary fitness is linked to close, supportive relationships with others, social environments can influence a variety of psychophysiological outcomes. So the first part of what I'll speak about next is this link between joint movement or physical activity and social bonds. So looking at the effects of collective movement, physical activity on social bonding. And then we go back sort of the other way. So effects of social bonds on movement or physical activity experiences. I was conscious that I was in the post-lunch slot on a Saturday and I might be jet lagged. So I'm not going to go into much of the various, and it's very plural, kind of drawing from different levels and explanations, various explanatory theories. We won't have time to bring all of that in. I want to give more of an overview of kind of the things that we found out. But just to bear in mind that a lot of this is taking these sort of rich descriptions I've been offering, looking to the literature to see, is there anything that we can draw on here to suggest that there really is something going on here, and bringing those two together. So that latter stage is kind of looking to the kind of cognitive science literature for explanatory theory. I won't have time to go into all of the details. So I'm going to give just a little one slide overview of some of the things that we've been finding out over about the last 10 years, and then spotlight one study and just tell you how we did it and what we found out. And I spotlighted this, each one, there's two for each of the parts of the question, because they're kind of works in progress. So any kind of comments and feedback would be very welcome. But they're the latest, hot, not quite off the press yet. So we found that moving together in time, so this idea of behavioral synchrony, increases feelings of social connection and oneness. So I'd say this is one of our kind of active ingredients to social bonding, and however we want to define this space of kind of joint action. Behavioral synchrony increases feelings of social connection and oneness, including in children, across groups. So you can set up, this was with kids in groups of 6, and we were able to set them up as kind of differentiating themselves into groups. And they very much liked their own group, didn't so much care for the other group. They made little flags for their own groups and so on. And then we brought them together, and we also taught them some moves. Like, I wouldn't say it was dance, but it was to music and so on, and brought them back into a room together. And in one condition, they performed these moves face to face with the other group in synchrony. And in one, it was out of sync. They had little headphones. So we were able to play a kind of the metronome beat for them to follow. And in the synchronous condition, these prior group effects, when we then measured them afterwards, they disappeared. It was almost like the other group was the same group in this particular study. So we've seen it in children in little sort of clap and tap games and things like that. They'll help each other a lot, really significantly more if they've done this clap and tap in synchrony versus not. And we found it in immersive virtual reality as well. We didn't study it in immersive virtual reality just to do something kind of cool. It's cool that we found it, but we did it in there because we were able to actually control some things that we just can't very easily in terms of setting up this synchronous versus non-synchronous manipulation. Another active ingredient, perhaps, seems to be exertion. So higher exertion levels. So if you have people do moderate versus low intensity activity, this will boost their positive emotion. Maybe that's something to do with reward mechanisms that kick in when we're kind of doing this sort of exertive physical activity, and also social bonding. So exertion is perhaps part of the story here. And that was actually based on evidence that moderate intensity physical activity as compared with low intensity physical activity is known to boost the endogenous systems involved in alleviating pain and fatigue. And these same systems are also involved in social bonding and reward. Those were all experimental studies. And then we move on to more observational research. So this was in a playground study where we found again that moderate to vigorous physical activity in kids playing in their normal playtime is associated with more positive emotion, measured through behavioral measures like laughter and smiling, as well as positive social behaviors like sort of pro-social touch, hugging or something like that, not pushing someone off the swing or that kind of thing. So pro-social touch, pro-sociality, as compared with low impact or sedentary activity. We've also found in a real world, this is a thing called the 10 Tours Challenge. It's been running for over 50 years in Dartmoor in southwest England, and it's run by the military. And you've got 2,400 kids every year in groups of 6 who traverse the moor. They have various checkpoints along the way and they camp overnight, and they have to be entirely self-sufficient for the duration of this trek. It's up to 55 kilometers, different lengths, but the longest is 55 kilometers. So it's a really nice kind of context in which to look at possible active ingredients of doing these kinds of activities together in terms of social bonding effects. So we find that perceived interdependence, how much they helped one another and how much they needed one another. That's how we measured that. And various kinds of support, particularly emotional support, I've got your back kind of support, and esteem support, you can do this, in this real world physical challenge is associated with positive changes in bonding. And that in turn contributed to an increase in their self-reported well-being from before the event to after the event. The military very kindly set up a kind of lab tent in the middle of the moor on their base there, and so we had these wonderful laptops all hooked up to the internet for these teams. We captured them as they came through off the hills, absolutely exhausted, to fill in some of our questionnaires. And then joint action success is associated with higher visceral interdependence. This is a term that we've coined, which is in turn associated with greater social bonding. So again, this is a more observational study, and this is the one that I want to maybe spotlight a little bit now. So joint action, when successful, is associated with a feeling of click, which we talked a little bit about, the click of communality, or what we've called visceral interdependence, which is in turn associated with social bonding. Can everybody hear me okay? Not fading? Okay. Okay, so this particular study on joint action success, visceral independence, and social bonding drew a lot, again, on the ethnographic and sport literature, particularly this idea of the click of communality. So here's the quote where we got this notion of, click of communality comes directly from here, but everyone's familiar with the notion of sort of team click, when the coordination and the thing just clicks and the action works. So when a collection of individuals first gels as a team, truly begins to react as a 5-headed or 11-headed unit, rather than as an aggregate of 5 or 11 individuals, you can almost hear the click. A new kind of reality comes into existence. And then there are a few features that we've identified across different kinds of reports of this sort of thing. Something like an aura, or a sort of at least positive emotion around this experience. There's an aura when a team feels right, that is almost magical. We had that, Steve Redgrave said. I could sense how the next play would develop and where the next shot would be taken. My premonitions would be consistently correct. There were moments when I had chills pulsing up and down my spine. It's this idea of kind of a flow or coherence in joint action. This one, I think, captures something like sort of a tacit understanding among the team members. The individuals are not just coordinating actions, but harmonizing them. None of the actions of the individual makes sense without each of the actions of the whole. The run into space must be timed to coincide not just with the pass of one teammate, but with the simultaneous movement of a different teammate, now blocking the incursion of an opponent and a third and fourth teammate, creating more possibilities. So this also captures the inherent uncertainty that goes on in these kinds of joint action scenarios. And that's something that we think maybe plays in to the, when it works, that plays into the positive effects. At the very moment, so interdependence again, at the very moment of success, you cannot isolate your own individual effort from the effort of the entire rugby scrum. In this case, you cannot tell where your strength ends and the efforts of the others begin. In a sense, you no longer exist as an individual human being. You become part of something larger and more powerful than you yourself could be. And ultimately, each member of a winning team brings something unique and vital to the overall endeavour. For Steve Redgrave, for me, it was those 4 teammates in Sydney that were needed to win. So bonding entails a felt emotional quality. We feel connected, we click, we're in tune or in sync with those that we like to be around and to engage with in joint activities. And in this study, we really wanted to try to capture some of that visceral experience of when things just click as a team and find out how joint action contributes to that experience and whether it in turn contributes to social bonding. So Jacob Taylor, who was a PhD student of mine at the time, he had done quite a bit of work around ethnography and rugby previously in China. China doesn't have a long tradition of rugby, but there's certainly a growing and strong tradition, particularly of rugby sevens. And he was keen to go back and look at some of these questions in that context. And we found very similar, I'm not going to read them all out, but we found very similar kinds of things cropping up in that context in his 10-month ethnography that he did, ethnographic research that he did before we went on to try and quantify some of this. Talks about team aura and so on. The coherence, I've got these terms over here, positive atmosphere, coherence or flow, tacit understanding, the extension or magnification of the self to the group, that sense that you don't know where your efforts end and the efforts of the next individual begins, particularly in things like maybe a rugby scrum or a rowing 8, and the interdependence. And so we've called this, just for starters, there's probably a lot more work to do, but putting this all together in a package, we've called this, I guess, something like team click or visceral interdependence. And I've already said this is what we've been interested to try and test. Does joint action success lead to visceral interdependence, and is that associated with social bonding? So we carried out a study in the context of the National Rugby Sevens Championship. It's an annual championship in China. There were 174 professional rugby players who participated, and there were several high-stake matches that they participated in over 2 days. And we administered our surveys to them before, during, and after the tournament. I'll focus on the data that we have from before and after. The during was to get a bit of a sense of what's happening during the tournament, but because they were in such time pressure, we didn't have the full battery of measures during the tournament. So for joint action performance, we asked about perceptions of team performance in technical aspects, such as defense, attack, support play, and on-field communication. Some example items there. How do you feel about your team's coordination of the defensive line? I think the options there were very poor or extremely strong. I think it was poor, weak, strong, something like that. And we were interested in controlling for their individual performance as well. So we controlled for perceptions of individual performance in our analyses. We also asked them about their performance relative to their expectations. Did they do much better than, did they integrate their team performance aspects much better than they expected, or much worse than expected, or pretty much as expected? Because we felt like doing better than expected is part of this positive, the big positive kick that you might get under very uncertain, high stakes context. And then we had several measures of visceral interdependence here, using local colloquial terms that capture some of these ideas that we've talked about. So how is the atmosphere around the team? Do you feel that your individual ability is extended by the ability of your teammates? Through to some standard social bonding measures, again, all self-report, emotional support, commitment to shared goal, oneness with the team. Sorry, there's a typo there, but identity fusion, different measures of kind of a sense of visceral oneness with the group. And we had some additional controls in our analyses, like because we wanted to really focus on, for example, the link between joint action and visceral independence. It mattered that we controlled for actually just how well they did on the score chart, right? So tournament performance was controlled for, individual technical competence, injury status, and so on. So what did we find? I'm conscious I'm quite short on time, so I better crack on. Very briefly, okay, joint action performance, we find a very strong relationship between joint action performance and visceral interdependence. I should say we took a change score, so this is the post score minus the pre, and we did our analyses on these change scores, what happened over time from before the tournament to after the tournament. So more positive perceptions of joint action success are associated with higher levels of visceral interdependence. And again, visceral interdependence was predicted by or associated with joint action performance that exceeded, particularly when it exceeded expectations. And in turn, visceral interdependence was associated with social bonding. So higher levels of visceral interdependence associated with higher levels of social bonding. And joint action performance also directly predicted social bonding. And these were really quite independent pathways. Visceral interdependence and joint action performance were quite independent pathways to social bonding. So athletes who feel the click of joint action also report higher levels of social bonding to their team. And we think this is maybe the start of a novel account of social bonding through joint action that considers the phenomenology of visceral interdependence that arises from the successful execution of joint action, in this case in team sport. And I think this maybe goes beyond sort of traditional mind reading frameworks in social cognition, but it also takes these questions about how joint action works and its effects to the meaningful real world. More generally, we might say that going inside the mind on the question of social bonding necessitates going outside the head to the couplings of brain, body, and social environment. But of course, this is all associational, not causal. We can't say it is. So experiments are needed. So as quickly as I can on this other question, what are the effects of social bonds and physical activity experiences? And here we focus, as I said, particularly on perceived fatigue and energy regulation. So actually, being with others makes exercise more fun. That's something that we've identified in a parkrun context. And it also indirectly predicts better performance via felt energy. So coming with others, running with others, predicts higher sense that you've got the energy to run, felt energy, and that predicts better performance. It's interesting that it happens in a fun context because people don't go there primarily. We measured this. They don't go primarily to beat other people or with really strong motivations to perform extremely well. But we still see these performance effects. Then in kind of more strenuous, high stakes activities, social effects of performance and perceptions of pain and fatigue and energy have been observed across a range of contexts in our studies, like rowing and cycling, and also sprinting. So what we're finding is increased performance for the same or lower perceived exertion and fatigue. I don't know if it's kind of pain giving way to ecstasy, but there seems to be something like what we saw in those examples going on. So increased performance, but they're not feeling that it's any harder. And the same performance sometimes, depending how we set out, for lower perceived exertion and fatigue, which I think is really interesting. And we find that these effects of social support, we've manipulated social support, various aspects of social bonding, that they're stronger under objectively more difficult conditions. So this was in a very controlled hand grip study that we did, where you can make it objectively more difficult and see how subjectively they respond to that, but also their performance output. And so we see that they're giving more power output under a socially supportive condition, but not with any parallel increase in perceived fatigue again. And our kind of template for a lot of this research was placebo research in sport, which is a fascinating field, where if you give people what they think to be an ergogenic aid, they will very often perform better, again, saying, gosh, it felt a lot easier. And it's tempting to say that that's all in the mind, whatever that means. But there are other kind of neurobiological things going on in a top-down way where people's beliefs seem to modulate, as we know in other contexts like placebo analgesia and pain. Beliefs in a top-down way modulate how the body-brain process pain. And we're finding this, the sports people are doing this as well. You can elicit placebo effects in various ways. There are ethical issues around this. You can condition people to perform better with obviously a real ergogenic aid, then slip them a placebo, tell them it's real on the day of the competition, and you'll still see very similar effects. Seems to be endorphin and endocannabinoid related. So really interesting. That was a kind of template for us looking, okay, how we perceive our environment, what we believe to be around in terms of resources, social resources or otherwise, can affect how the body works in these activities. And social effects we find can be engendered through various different manipulations, cues of bonding, so synchronizing before you do the sprint, for example, cue of an attachment figure, so a photograph in a screen in front of you, social connection and integration. So in the parkrun study, we just asked questions like, how integrated do you feel with the parkrun community? And then interestingly, so these social effects can be explained by greater energy expenditure. So that's the final study that's very recent that we've just run, that requires physiological measurements. So in this study, we wanted to find out whether the increased performance for the same or reduced fatigue was because people are somehow, I mean, maybe they're just more energetically efficient when they're in a supportive context. Maybe anxiety goes down and that helps them be more efficient in terms of how muscles work. Or our favorite hypothesis, does a supportive and safe social context alter how we allocate, expend, and conserve energy? So even in high stakes, highly motivated settings, the body's naturally conservative with its energetic reserves, something that we experience subjectively as fatigue. So perhaps, this is our thought, perhaps we can afford to be less conservative when we have the support of others. Others obviously signal resources. They do so from the various earliest days of infancy. And this is reflected, this support and this kind of lower conservation of energy, greater release of energy is reflected in the calibration of fatigue that we experience. So we could expend more energy and achieve higher performance for the same or lower level of perceived fatigue. And this we've called a kind of buffering account. So distinguishing between an efficiency and a buffering account requires measuring oxygen consumption, which is the standard measure of energy expenditure. This is a study with Aaron Davis, postdoc, and a colleague, Chris Beattie, from exercise physiology and psychology, and Aaron Greenhouse-Tucknott, an expert in psychology and physiology of fatigue. Both of these latter two, Chris and Aaron, are from a sports physiology kind of background, but very much cognitive scientists, I would say. So the manipulation here, we had a rowing test. So participants rowed until they could row no more at a certain level, while viewing either a support figure face that they submitted or a stranger face that we had that was matched on various characteristics. And this was the within subjects design. So participants took part in both of these conditions. And our key measures were their physical output. So what was their power output overall? Their cumulative energy expenditure, so looking at cumulative oxygen consumption, and then the self-report measures, perceived effort, perceived fatigue, and motivation. So effort here is kind of how hard or strenuous does it feel when you're, exercising, and they're asked this as they are exercising. And fatigue is kind of more before you start, you feel extremely fresh. When you're almost ready to give up, you feel exhausted. So there's slightly different kinds of constructs. And then we also wanted to control for motivation, just ensure that they weren't just more motivated in one condition than the other. So very briefly, the support figure cue we found, so the photograph of the friend or loved one, this is described as someone who's there for you in times of need. Support figure cue led to significantly greater cumulative work. It was actually, in this study design, they rode for longer. But there was no significant effect on perceived fatigue, effort. So that's what we'd seen before, and that was replicated here. And they weren't just trying harder, kind of just more motivated. Normally, when we see people perform higher, we tend to perform better. We tend to think of that in terms of something like grit, or, you're just determined. But it could be about how energy is regulated. So that's why we're measuring motivation. And crucially, the support figure Q led to significantly greater energy expenditure as well. So this helps, maybe it's not final, but helps to rule out just an economy or efficiency explanation. We've developed this as what we've sort of dubbed the social brawn hypothesis. I don't have time for much of the detail now, I'm sorry, but I've already kind of mentioned it in brief. Cooperative sociality, we're saying, so this is really coming from an evolutionary kind of perspective, but cooperative sociality can relax the safety margin that serves to conserve energy for other activities. And cues to social safety can modulate or calibrate this calculation. Should I conserve? Should I go for gold? What's my context like? And that's all kind of registered in where fatigue is calibrated, how loud the alarm bells of fatigue sound, when they start to sound. Okay, so cues to social safety can modulate and calibrate sensations or alarms of perceived effort and fatigue. It's important to say that there's no sort of one-to-one relationship between the amount of energy that we expend and the intensity of subjectively experienced fatigue and exercise. There are so many different variables that come into that equation. Okay, and so therefore, for a given level of perceived effort and fatigue, performance increased, more energy is released. Ultimately, social bonds can facilitate access to hidden reserves potentially via these mechanisms. And I know this is very much kind of sports and perhaps about performance gains and so on. I'm not so much interested in marginal gains in sports performance and getting people gold medals and so on. It's more, I'm interested in how we function, how this stuff works in humans, how the social and the physiology go together, and ultimately and hopefully developing this into a more general account of what we might call social energetics, which explores social effects on energy expenditure in everyday life more broadly. So to conclude, these two, I think, very different studies, one much more kind of real world observational, one very multi-level, very controlled laboratory experiment, I think they can illustrate, or I hope they can illustrate, following Bob, the mutual interdependence of interpretation and explanation. Fertile interpretations can point us to new explanations, and explanations can guide our interpretations of complex real-world phenomena in terms of their active causal ingredients, for example, something like exertion or synchrony. I think they also point out, we talked about the two sides, the length and width of a triangle being inseparable before physiology and sociality. To this, I'd add cognition, particularly sort of physiologically and socially enabled cognition, and this interdependence between these different parts. So mental processes, as many are arguing now, are embodied and social. Bodily processes are coordinated and regulated by this kind of embodied and social cognition, and social processes occur within and between individual mind bodies. And I think this highlights the importance of pluralistic integration of theory and diverse types of measures across these aspects to better understand human thought and behavior scientifically. And ultimately as well, maybe not ultimately, but maybe hopefully as well, that the role anthropology can play in cognitive sciences, it's still, the invitation's still there, right? There can be cognitively informed ethnography and ethnographically informed cognitive science. And I think all of this can challenge orthodox assumptions and break down silos, ultimately. There can be a cognitive science of culture, a social ecology of fatigue, a physiology of social bonding, and a social science of endurance and energetics. So Bob and Tom, thank you. Almost feel tearful. Thank you for your inspiration and your support. Yeah, it's been meant a lot. Like Claire, I definitely wouldn't be here without you, Justin, Harvey, Pascal, helping me see that there's another way to think about these questions. There's another way to be an anthropologist, even if anthropologists don't think I am one. So you'll continue to inspire me and many others to redress some of these imbalances. And should you choose to keep going, and I know you're still writing, we've got your back. So
thank you. That was great. I have a question about the role of outgroups in this process. So do you have any predictions or expectations? Let's say, for example, you have a group of runners doing a relay on their own versus a group of runners who are doing a marathon, but not part of a team. In other words, what is there a unique or, an exacerbated effect of knowing that not only are you part of a team, but that you're part of a team who is in competition with another team? Because evolutionarily, you would expect that it would bracket up the effect. And I wonder if you've thought about that and what your thoughts are.
yeah, I think probably you're going to get the most. We have thought, we tried to keep competition and related ideas of, say, reputation and so on. There's a well-known effect in sports. This is actually where sports psychology started, was with social facilitation effects. I mean, it's a really big umbrella term. It's really catch-all, but it tends to focus on something like, I'm worried if someone's watching that I'll let them down, I'll let them down, or I need to save face. It tends not to be on the more kind of social support effects that can facilitate performance. So we try to keep that out of the picture, and competition likewise. We think, I mean, I was going to say, if you get this combination of support and competition, that's probably where you're going to get the greatest of these effects. It just adds to the stakes, right? It adds to the motivation, and motivation, goals, the stakes, what's at stake, all feed into this equation of, do I release energy? I mean, it's not a conscious thing. But shall I release energy for this activity, or shall I conserve it for something that could be even more important, like the predator that's just going to round the corner after I finish this poxy little race, So it depends, so if you really care, I mean, if you're very competitive, it also depends on the kind of personality things as well, just how much you care about the competitive element. But that's where we've thought about it. And I think some of these really ultra endurance marathons, for example, where you've got your support team and you've got the competition, but the competition is also supporting you as well. When you're down, people aren't going to run past you. In other sports that might happen, but that might be a really interesting context, I think, to observe these different intersecting factors. Thanks, Claire. I don't know if you can hear me.
I like to talk a lot, and I essentially, I don't think I need it. I essentially buy your hypotheses and your conclusions. And I thought that the discussion of the friendly, it's not going to help. I thought that the discussion of the friendly versus stranger faces was I thought that was really effective. But some of the other examples, I didn't see how you could distinguish between the social effects and the simple problem-solving effects interpreted in terms of the very general relations between tension and resolution. Tension and resolution is everywhere. Sex, music, dramatic narrative structures. And it seems to me if people have a problem, and it's a problem in an area where they know that the social organization, for logical reasons, is key to the solution of the problem, then when they realize that through proper social coordination, they're solving the problem, they will get a sense of release and satisfaction, which is as much a problem-solving satisfaction as it is a intrinsically social one. Similarly, for some of your physical examples, it seemed to me that you might mainly be talking about the release of endorphins. I've like a lot of runners. I mean, in fact, there used to be, I haven't run seriously since the 80s, but there used to be a whole theory of how you begin to release more endorphins through high and increasing levels of exertion that elevate your mood throughout the day and the week. So I think there are alternative explanations that some of your examples don't address, although I thought the strange and happy, the strange and friendly face experiments seem to transcend those problems.
Yeah. So that was the second part of the talk. I think I mean, I agree. There's a lot more work to be done, obviously, but with, you know, whether it's just about individual problem solving or a social effect, I mean, we still need to investigate this more. This is just a very early kind of observational study of what might be going on here. But the goals are clearly held. The goal to win, or to create flow, to perform well in joint action, is an individual goal. Everybody has that goal, let's assume. But they know, I know that you have that goal, and you know that I have that goal. And that's kind of the basis of a shared intentionality, or having a shared goal that we've all bought into. And ultimately, in order to achieve that goal, even calling it an individual goal, I need you and you need me. And we know that, I know that you know, and all of that, all those endless regress. And I think part of the effects that we're seeing, the social effects, come from somewhere in that space. And I think there's maybe, I mean, this is all very conjectural, speculative, but I think there's an element of, yay, I achieved my goal. Great, problem solved. But quick on the heels of that, integrated with that, is I could never have done it without you, you know? So I think there is maybe something like, it's not, I don't think gratitude is the right word, but some part of this emotion is incorporating that sharedness. I don't know if that helps answer. It's all just speculation, but I think there's something different about achieving my own goal, let's say, as a solo tennis player. I mean, all of these examples aren't good because you've got your team always behind you, whatever sport you play. But achieving that through your own individual action versus a joint action in which it could go any which way. There's so many degrees of freedom, but we pulled it off because we had the skill and we had the motivation. And so I could never have done it myself. I'm grateful to you. And in fact, where it's indistinguishable what I did and, you know, where my efforts end and where yours begin, I think that perhaps becomes even stronger. The other part about endorphins, well, I did mention briefly, and I mean, it is part of the explanatory hypothesis for some of this, particularly the exertion. That was one of the reasons why we thought there's maybe something going on with exertion. So like I said, we're looking at the ethnographic and these kind of sports anecdotes, to kind of determine what are the active ingredients, but we're also looking to any kind of theory that can help us get a handle on this. In this case, you know, neurobiological. And we started thinking about endorphins, but in fact, that study between low and moderate intensity activity was guided by a newer literature on endocannabinoids in exercise. And I think that literature still needs to distinguish, is the runner's high actually about endorphins, or is it about endocannabinoids, or both, or something else? Endocannabinoids seem to really kick in at a moderate level in intensity. So Dave Reichling's he's an evolutionary anthropologist, he's done some fantastic work on endocannabinoids, suggesting that when we became persistent runners, endurance runners for persistence hunting, it was endocannabinoids, which are an ancient thing that we've had for all kinds of other, you know, things in our system, was co-opted to support the fatigue and pain and endurance systems in endurance running at moderate intensity levels. It's an inverted U. So once you get up to high intensity levels, it seems to drop off. The question for me is that when the endorphins kick in? You know, we don't really know. So there might be another reward system that kicks in. I could go on. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. And it's Demetrius's time, I think. Yeah. Thank you.